Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. One quick announcement. Solo has its first sponsor. Today's episode of Solo is sponsored by Rapture Masks. That's Rapture with a W, like wrap it up. And since I recommend wearing protection during sex, I also recommend wrapping your face when you go out into the wild. And Rapture has made the best non-medical grade mask money can buy. It's antimicrobial, breathable, and most importantly, fully machine washable, so you aren't one and done. One mask lasts over 50 washes. I've been using it for weeks, and it's my favorite mask. You can find them on Twitter, Instagram, and at rapturemasks.com. That's Rapture, W-R-A-P-T-U-R-E, masks.com. And you can use promo code RaptureSolo, again with a W, at checkout for a discount. Stay safe out there, people. Okay, now on to the episode. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Peter McGraw. Yes, this is the second installment of Solo Thoughts, where I share some ideas that I've been thinking about and talking about in private. Part 1 focused on health, specifically sleep, nutrition, and exercise, i.e. movement. This one, and as you know, as I talked about then, was that health is this building block, the foundation for a remarkable life. Today's topic is well-being, something that came up in the What is a Remarkable Life episode with Jill Cohen and Julie Nervelli. I'm going to build on a little bit of those ideas. But let's just jump right in. Oh, wait. One announcement before we begin. I'm going to be giving one free coaching session, a solo coaching session, to the first listener who reaches out to me requesting it. So when you hear this, don't hesitate. Reach out to me and we will set up a free solo coaching session on the topic of your choice. It'll be fun. Okay. Let's start by talking about sugar. So sugar came up in Solo Thoughts 1, and I was referring to the real sugar, the evil sugar that you are so familiar with. And I told a story about how I gave up sugar, at least, by 80 standards, when I was 15 years old. Or maybe I didn't, but I've been reasonably sugar-free, at least in the kind of sweets, desserts kind of area since I was 15. So I stopped drinking soda, I stopped eating candy, and I did that, frankly, because of sports, because of athletics, because I was trying to get good at something that initially I wasn't very good at. And I wanted to get lean and strong and so on, and it was pretty clear to me that drinking Coke and eating 3 Musketeers bars was not going to help me do that. Now, I bring this up because I like to say that sugar has a particular profile, and that profile is good in the moment, but bad in the long run. And if you take sugar and you think about it as kind of a metaphor, well, you can start thinking about a lot of things in life that are good in the moment, but bad in the long run. And so this is a good segue into talking about well-being, or as I like to say, living a good life, or as I like to say for this podcast, living a remarkable life. How can you maximize that? So what are those things in your life that are the sugar? I mean, for some of you, it'll be sugar. And that's something that would behoove you to move along from, to minimize. But sugar can have, in this metaphorical sense, some different consumption experiences. So I'll give you 3, 2 of which I've conquered and 1 of which I'm working on. So the first one that comes to mind is when I turned 18 and went off to college. So prior to that, I was kind of part of that generation where video games became a thing. So I'm old enough to remember Pong. I'm old enough to remember Pac-Man exploding onto the scene. And so in many ways was sort of part of the inceptions of video games, which are not only alive and well, but thriving, not only with kids, but with adults. I wish I could remember the exact reasoning behind all of this. But when I went to college, I remember making a decision that I wasn't going to play video games anymore. Now, to me, video games serve that sort of sugary metaphor quite nicely. You know, they are lots and lots of fun to play. They have gotten tremendously fun to play, challenging, and they have been certainly better engineered to capture attention, to be entertaining and distracting. Yet when I was 18 and went off to college, I decided that I was not going to play video games, even though I had friends who in college who did play games. And occasionally I would hang out with them in their dorm room while they played and chatted with them. But I never really picked up a controller. And I'm very happy that I didn't. Some of that was there were just, to me, way more interesting, entertaining things to do, you know, besides the obvious, which is like, I need to go to class, I need to study, but I was still participating in sports. I was working. I had a diverse, fun group of friends. I tried to date, but wasn't very good at it. But even trying and failing at dating to me was more fun than video games. So thankfully, I moved on from that. The next one I want to talk about came many, many years later. And it was a much slower process, and it was one in which I didn't find to be as easy as giving up my sugary video games. And that was to give up sugary sports spectating. Now this one I do remember exactly what my thinking was, in part because I wrote some blog posts about it. And it really started with football, with watching professional football and watching college football. So I, like many American men, grew up watching football. I played football in high school. I played it very poorly. I do not have the build of a football player, and I'm lucky that I didn't, and I'm lucky that I rode the bench, and I'm lucky that I never concussed myself and damaged my brain too much playing that sport. But quickly, the reasoning that I had behind watching football kind of fell into three categories. So one is that I started to realize that watching sports in general, and football specifically, was not a good form of entertainment. And I like to quip that putting your happiness in the hands of a bunch of young men in an oblong ball is not a good idea. That is, that one thing about sports that's really striking versus other forms of entertainment is half the time, on average, the outcome that you want doesn't happen. That is, half the time you watch and are disappointed with the outcome. And that doesn't happen nearly as much with other forms of entertainment, especially nowadays when things are pretty well reviewed. So, you have a pretty good idea that the movie you're going to watch is going to be good, that the book you're going to read is going to be good, that the album you're going to listen to or the concert that you're going to go to is going to be good. And even when it isn't good, it's not as devastatingly bad as when your favorite team loses a big game. And so this was simply a mathematical formula for me, which was that the expected value of other forms of entertainment ended up being higher than the expected value of sports watching. The second one was also a very practical thing, which was that, especially at that time, I was doing a lot of sitting. Had been working on a book. I was deep in writing academic papers for my humor research. I was spending hours a day sitting on my ass. And to add another 3 to 3.5 hours per game to sitting just didn't make sense to me. That is, that if I was going to do something athletic related, I would be better off moving my own body rather than watching other people move their bodies. And so I'm really struck by the amount of time that sedentary people who have sedentary jobs, spend doing a sedentary activity, watching 1, 2, 3, 4 games across a weekend. And that just didn't make good sense to me. So the first one is, and as an aside, for the first one with regard to half the time that your team loses, there's this thing called the negativity bias. And as a result, it actually hurts more when your team loses than the intensity of when your team wins. And so it's really working against you. And so that was in my early 40s. And the third thing, and this is football related, and I've already alluded to it, is I actually, frankly, started to question the morality of watching football, of being a sports spectator in that way. But by that time, and certainly nothing has changed this belief, is that it's just so incredibly clear that playing football is so bad for the brains of the participants. The damage is so colossal and so consistently bad that to support that endeavor in many ways I started to feel was morally questionable. And so I gave up sports spectating in general and football specifically. I will admit, I'm going to admit this, there is one little bit of a holdout, and that's I watch a little bit of basketball, and I watch it specifically for LeBron James. I just enjoy his game so much. But at some point he'll retire, and I will be down to 0. Okay. So that has had a positive effect on my life because it has freed up emotional energy, actual time, and now on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, I'm much, much more likely to be doing something that's active. And if it is passive in consumption, it's likely to be something that's either going to be more enjoyable or more educational. Now, the last form of sugar, metaphorically, has been for me very recent. And this is something that I have been kind of circling around for many years now. My time in the desert has certainly hammered it home, and that is the use of social media. While I do think that there are positive uses of social media in terms of connecting with people, in terms of gathering information, in terms of education, the worry is that much of social media has that sugary profile, which is pleasurable in the moment, but not really helping you in the long run, and perhaps even hurting you in the long run. And yeah, I don't have to tell you this, but the Twitter sphere and Facebook and Instagram less so, of course, but these various forms of social media have become very dark, polarized places, and ones in which it's not even clear how positive they are anymore. And so I have been throttling back my social media consumption and then participation. It's important enough for my business, at least my interest in terms of Twitter per se, that I'm not going to take it down to 0, but it's something that is I've identified as a bit problematic. So what I invite you to do at the onset of this episode is to think about, where do you find the sugar in your life? That is, the things that are pleasurable in the short term, in the moment, but don't help you or hurt you even in the long term, and how might you go about starting to minimize that. The football one was interesting because it took a while, because it had built up so much of a habit in terms of not only the watching, but also consuming all the media around it, going on to ESPN.com and so on, and even engaging in conversations and so on. The nice thing about it was that it was sort of a slow process. And as I started to kind of shed those habits, delete those bookmarks and so on, I've replaced them with more useful activities. And now I get to a point where I don't even not only do I not miss it, but I also don't even know what's going on. And so if someone tries to talk to me about what is going on, I have no idea. And for the especially gentlemen who are thinking about this and sort of pushing back on it, I would say to you, really what sports really, really gets down to is it's a soap opera of sorts. And so if you wouldn't consider watching a soap opera, I ask you to consider not watching sports or whatever your form of sugar is. I don't know what that might be. I just know the profile to be on the lookout. Okay. So as you know, if you're a regular listener, one of the themes with regard to living a remarkable life, solo or not, is this assertion that I have of trying to create more than you consume. Now, that's already very ambitious because the average person is creating so little in their lives that their creation is so dwarfed by their consumption. And so this is really an ambitious starting point, but I think it's a worthy goal to have. And we cover this in various previous episodes. Write Your Way Out. It comes up in the What is a Remarkable Life, or What Makes a Life Remarkable. I think that's the title of the episode. And it comes up so often you might be sick of hearing about it. But what I want to, and when I talk about creating, I talk about creating really very broadly. I'm going to pause on that idea for a moment and actually focus on consumption for a moment. And that is, I had this realization recently, and it's not all consumption is the same. And so not all consumption is the same, as evidenced by my sugar stories. So those are what I would call less appealing forms of consumption. But there are actually really, we can't always be in a creating mindset. We always, we might need a little bit of a break. So I'm going through this right now where I really don't have a big focal project at the moment. I have some things to do. This is probably the closest at the moment that I have to a focal project, but I'm about to start one. But in the meantime, I've kind of been easing off creating a little bit, and I've had a little bit more time to consume. Obviously, when I was out in the desert at the High Fidelity Homestead, I did a lot of consumption that was listening to music, and I did a lot of reading. Well, I think that when you think about consuming, not all is the same. So, for example, I think reading is a really wonderful form of consumption. And it's especially a wonderful form of consumption if you are a writer, if you write. So I think of reading as nutrition and writing as exercise. And so with that in mind, I think that all things equal, to read is just a tremendous way to consume. Obviously, podcasts have a similar bent to them. That is that they not only can transport you into other worlds, but you can learn information, you can be inspired, and so on. And the nice thing, obviously, about podcasts is that you can do it on the move. You can do it while you're commuting. You can do it while you're on a walk, and so on. So I tend to put podcasts in the same category as reading, although my preference is for reading insofar as it helps you slow down and think. It's a little bit more effortful in that sense. Someday I'll write a book about solo. That's what I'm guessing. But until then, it looks like you're just going to have to listen. Okay, so another form of consumption that I was thinking about. So with the pandemic, with quarantining and social distancing and so on, some museums aren't open right now. I actually started looking for museums that are going to be open that I can visit. I'm a huge fan of museums, whatever the type, but I have a very special place in my heart for modern art museums in general. You would think it would be like natural history because I'm a huge nerd, but I just love modern art museums. And the reason that I like a museum so much as a sort of good form of consumption is they're just so inspirational to me. That is that when I go and see these exhibits, especially when you start to do a little bit of research and understanding into the context of and the reasoning and rationale behind the artwork, you realize that art is this creative process. It's focused on novelty and innovation, I think is really inspiring to me. And so I regularly, when I go to a museum, I bring my notebook with me and I find myself sitting down and scribbling out ideas and notes about what I'm seeing and feeling, or even, it doesn't even have to be what I see at the museum, but what's going on in my life. And so I think museums are really great forms of consumption, because, again, it has that inspirational element to it. And you can obviously contrast this with other forms of entertainment. It's easy to pick on reality TV, and so I will. So compare it to like reality TV, for example. So I just say that I invite you to try to shift away from consuming and to shift especially away from the sugary stuff to the not so sugary stuff. I don't think of going to a museum as sugar, for example. Now, in terms of creating, I want this idea of creation to to be a big tent. It doesn't have to be creating a podcast, or it doesn't have to be writing a novel or making a short film, although all of those things can be really wonderful uses of time. A, because you can really lean in and engage and learn and be challenged personally and professionally. And then B, when you do those things, you have something to show for it. But this came up in the Dude Get a Haircut episode. And in the Dude Get a Haircut episode, my guest Anthony Full and I talked about making or fixing something. So this was an idea that came from a book called Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. Cal Newport makes a very strong, strenuous argument about staying away from social media. And he's been tremendously successful in his professional career and his personal career, and manages to do this with just a blog. And it's a great read, as well as his other previous books called Deep Work and So Good They Can't Ignore You. I'll put them in the exhibits. So Cal talks about finding time to make or fix things. And the idea essentially is when you're making something or fixing something, it's very easy to be present. And especially if you can do that without the temptation of your computer or phone, if you can put those things away. In that previous episode, I talk about fixing the rat's nest of wires that were behind my television and stereo system in my home back in Boulder, and how I had been putting that off. And then one day I decided to pull the console out and tackle that problem. And one of the really striking things about me, quote unquote, fixing that problem was how focused I ended up being with it, and how good it felt to have accomplished it. And so I've been talking about this idea of tidying up. Frankly, I become obsessed with it. So I just think it's such an interesting idea. Now, I'll admit that it's not for everyone. Some people are on the more tidy side of the spectrum than others. I happen to be on the super tidy side of the spectrum. That's probably not going to surprise you if you know me in any way. But let me make a case for the usefulness of tidying up. I argue that tidying up is a creation process, that you're creating a new state of the world. And I think that the benefits are multiple. So one benefit of tidying up is that when done well, you have fewer things as a result than you did before you began the tidy up process. So tidying up is not just necessarily about moving things to the correct location, although it can be, but it's often about removing, throwing out, recycling, donating, giving away the things that no longer serve you. And so it fits a sort of minimalist perspective where you then have fewer things. And I think that all things equal, if you can have a few fewer things in life, it just simplifies life, not only aesthetically, but also it does so psychologically. There's just fewer things to be concerned about. The next thing about tidying up that I like is that it's something you can accomplish. That is that, especially if you start small, such as a rat's nest of wires behind a TV and stereo, there's a sense of accomplishment that goes along with that. And in a world where we often go to work and don't feel like we're accomplishing anything, or we're working on a project and it's moving along so slowly we don't feel like we're accomplishing anything, I think that there's a psychological benefit of doing this. Moreover, I think it kind of gets you into the mode of accomplishing things. And so it sets you up to move on to the next task, another task where there's something to be accomplished. And then I think that the last benefit is not to the self, but to others. And that is, regardless of your feelings about how tidy or not tidy your space is, the tidiness of your space has an effect on your guest. So that those guests could be friends and family. It could be people that you're interested in dating and wanting to make a positive impression on, or it could be in a professional sense. That is, that people feel welcome in your space rather than feeling kind of discomfort with the space. So I look forward to hearing your tidying up stories and using that perhaps as a gateway to creating more. Okay, so the other idea with regard to well-being, and this is a very big idea, and this comes up time and time again, is the notion of how to think about well-being, how to think about living a good life, about how to think about living a remarkable life. And, there's not many good places to learn this. And part of the problem is the traditional model, the model that gets taught in school, is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure you've heard about it. And the idea essentially is that you have these sort of lower level needs, and only once those lower level needs are satisfied can you move on to sort of the higher and more psychological needs in with this goal of becoming self-actualized. Well, there's a lot of problems with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I can run through a bunch of them. I'll give you a couple and keep it brief. One problem is that it assumes that you need to conquer the lower level of need in order to move up Maslow's hierarchy. I actually don't believe that to be the case. Of course, I do agree with you that if you're starving to death, it's hard to live a remarkable life. Yes, there's no doubt about it. But for example, there's this notion of satisfying social needs, and your social needs need to be satisfied before you can move on to other like achievement-related needs. I actually don't believe that to be the case at all. I think that people can focus on achievement needs without having tackled the social stuff, or vice versa. So the other thing that really bothers me about it is that it's considered sort of universal theory. That is, that it's a theory that is useful regardless of what age you are or what culture you are. And so it ignores the fact that there might be differences in people's desires and what they consider to be a good life at age 20 or 40 or 60 or 80, or what constitutes a good life in the United States versus Greece versus Nairobi. And so I really push back on it. There's really a lot of problems with this idea. Now, if you're going to dismiss a tremendously popular and potentially useful model, you should have something to replace it with. And that, if you're a regular listener, you're going to be familiar with Martin Seligman's PERMA model. So Seligman is one of the fathers of positive psychology. He noticed that psychology was much more interested in deviance, problems, the dark side of being human, than it was about excelling in the world, about thriving, or as he would say, flourishing. And in his book, Flourish, he presents what I believe to be a very useful perspective in terms of thinking about not the path to a good life, but rather the paths to a good life. And learning this has had a really important effect on me. In particular, it has had a kind of calming effect. That is, that I realized that by doing what I sort of naturally set out to do and like to do, the things that kind of bring me, that compel me, or just because they may conflict or they may not match up with what other people do, what other people value, and what compels other people, doesn't mean that I'm wrong, doesn't mean that I'm doing it wrong, and that if I change my path, I could be living a good or better life, or more remarkable life, so to speak. And so the PERMA model is really fascinating because it builds on the work that psychologists and economists had been doing for many years as they looked at well-being. And they had identified these sort of two paths to a good life. So one is pleasure. It may go by the term happiness, but we'll call it pleasure. That is feeling good, experiencing pleasure, tasty meals, a good nap, sex, right? Watching your team winning the big game, whatever that may be, the things that are physically and emotionally pleasurable and joyous. And no doubt, lacking that in life, it really can have a big negative effect. The other path, which is potentially coming in conflict with this P in pleasure, is meaning, is that people are often compelled to do things that are meaningful, that create some purpose in their life, that make the world a better place than it would have otherwise. Now, what's striking is that, meaningful efforts, raising children, curing cancer, contributing to a scientific body of knowledge, to getting people to vote, all of these kinds of things may have a sort of satisfying element to them if they are actually accomplished, but they also may be at times really quite displeasurable. Writing academic papers is rarely pleasurable, even though it may be satisfying to get the paper published. Getting people to vote, canvassing in a neighborhood, is rarely pleasurable in the way that eating a dessert is. And we certainly know that from the data that raising children, when people say it makes them happy, they're not really using the term happy to describe pleasure. They're using the term happy to describe meaning. And so in Seligman's book, he outlines these two paths, and then what he says is that he had, in his work, a blind spot, that he had overlooked other ways that people flourish. And I'll give you those three other ways. So PERMA is an acronym, so P for pleasure. E is engagement, something that we've been kind of talking about prior to this with regard to the creation process in particular. But the idea of engagement is one that I think is often overlooked as a way to live a good life, and that is essentially the role that creative problem solving has on us psychologically and emotionally. That is when engaged in a challenging process, one in which you are solving problems, and solving problems ideally in a creative way. So art is a very good way to think about this, but it could be computer programming. It could be with regard to athletics even. But the idea is to be sort of fully focused and concentrating on some challenging task can create what's called a flow state. And the idea of flow is that it has this sort of, satisfying, mildly enjoyable feeling. It's not joyous in the way that an orgasm is joyous, but it is positive, and it has this really cool element where kind of time sort of slips away. And so we know people who are in pursuit of this sort of flow state, whether they're aware that they're pursuing it or not, I often question, but a lot of creative endeavors have the potential for flow state. And essentially it happens when your skill matches up with the challenge. If the challenge is greater than the skill, then you're anxious and stressed out. And if the skill is below the challenge, you get anxious and stressed out. And if your skill is above the challenge, you get bored. And so you're finding that sort of sweet spot where these things match up, which explains why both novices and experts can have flow states depending on what it is that they're working on. And I encourage people to try to think about where they might find that. Some people can find it in running. It explains why, for example, when you start running, it's just so damn terrible. But once you get good enough at it, people can be compelled to do it, that they can go on a run and it feels like time just passes by. So the next letter in the acronym is R for relationships. And for someone listening to a solo podcast, they may say, well, this one's not relevant to me, because I don't have the one person in my life. I'm not interested in the one person in my life. I'm not interested in a lifelong marriage. I'm not interested in riding the relationship escalator, which has been discussed in a previous episode. But relationships may have more or less prominence in people's lives, and those relationships don't have to necessarily be romantic and sexual. That is, that the connections to others, family, friends, community, and so on, can be valuable. They can be a source of support, a source of security, a source of information and interest. They can be fun, and that people to varying degrees really rely on that. And you can imagine also how these interests may expand or contract depending on people's development. So, for example, that the college oftentimes is very heavy on the P, lots of partying and fun and so on, and very heavy on the R, lots and lots of socialization and development around that kind of idea, as well as being connected to A, which is the final letter, which is achievement. And the idea behind achievement, and people often think of meaning and achievement as being closely connected. I don't think they need to be. But achievement is essentially accomplishing something that is very difficult, that few people or fewer people get to do. So you could connect it, for example, to running. So, achievement might be running your first marathon. You could connect it to engagement in terms of building a business and the problem solving that goes into building a business, but also having something to show for it. It can be connected to education, getting degrees, and so on. And so the PERMA model, pleasure, engagement, relationships, meaning, right, which we already talked about, and achievement, highlights these multiple paths to living a remarkable life. And it highlights how the paths may become more or less important depending on development. So, for example, suppose you just got divorced, you could see how maybe the R becomes a little less prominent in terms of, and going off and having a little bit of fun suddenly becomes more, or that you've been putting off starting a business or becoming a painter or whatever this might be, and that these priorities sort of shift in time. And the thing about it is that the model is sort of prescription free. It doesn't say that you should pursue one path or the other. One path is good and one path is bad. It's a matter of matching the path to what your interests might be and where you are in life and what is it that you need in the moment. And so this is connected to this idea that I talk about in my MBA class about heterogeneity. That is, yes, there are some things that are universal about people, right? So, for example, sugar tasting generally good is a universal, but whether someone is drawn to one path or another really depends on that person, depends on their culture, depends on where they are in life. And so where am I going with this idea? And what is it? Why am I bringing this up? Well, I think if you want to pursue, this very positive life, this flourishing life, this remarkable life, I think it helps to know that you might already be on that path. I think one of the best ways to figure out what is right and what is not right for you comes from looking at what you're sort of compelled to do, what you're sort of drawn to do. What is it that lights you up in a way? So my personal example of this was I'm always overscheduled. I've been overscheduled since I was 20 years old. I mean, I've gotten better about scheduling myself and I've got better about saying no to things, but I've always been overscheduled. Now, there were times where I needed to be because if I wasn't overscheduled, I wasn't going to have enough money to afford housing and food. And so I was working 3 jobs, even though it was stressing me out and it was a little too much to deal with, especially because I was doing it on top of a master's degree. But even once I got my finances more in order, I always found myself overscheduled. I'm always working on a secret project. I'm always trying new things. I'm always inviting people over for a burrito night or a dilemma dinner or something like that. And part of the reason is that I just started to realize that, these are kind of this engagement path, this sort of personal and professional growth path that I have has been just something that I just like to do. I just like to learn how to do new things. And I like that being transported in the moment as I'm working on something and trying to excel at it. And I've always, despite my sort of solo nature, my great desire for autonomy and my reluctance to invite someone to live in my home, I've always had a lot of connections to lots of different types of people and found myself continuing that creation engagement process not just by being connected to people through text messages and phone calls and meeting people for lunch, but by putting together parties and activities and events and so on, where I was making something along the way. So I invite you to get that book, and I invite you to reflect on these different paths and see how does it match up to the stuff that you do. And you might at first think that what you do is a problem because the world tells you it's a problem, because it doesn't match with getting on the relationship escalator, for example. It may not match because it may be too solitary, and people find that perplexing. But the cool thing about the PERMA model is it explains why like 3 different types of people can be living an equally remarkable life, at least from their perspective. So imagine an artist who gets up every day and sculpts or paints in his or her damp, drafty studio, makes very little money, gets no fame for their work, but is compelled to do it. Right? They're very heavy on the E. Or imagine the elite runner or swimmer, the Olympian, who spends lots of time in also a displeasurable state, which is in pain because of their training, but is focused on the A, on achievement. In this very small window of time, they have to try to win gold medals. Or imagine that parent raising a couple kids, and the lack of pleasure that may bring, but the great meaning that it does. Now, if you exchanged any of those people into the other person's role, that person would then become deeply unhappy, would not be living a remarkable life in their view. Then here's the other thing that I think is really quite interesting. Perhaps at some point that parent sends their kids off to school and is now an empty nester, and they decide to take that time and energy, not money because they're probably helping pay for the school, but that time and energy, and dedicate it to something else, right? They may move away from the M, from the meeting, to something. They may start a business and focus on the achievement and engagement. They may reconnect to others in their life and lean into other forms of R, the relationship. Your Olympian may shift gears away from achievement and get into other types of endeavors that focus on other acronyms that are there. And so just because you've been doing something a particular way doesn't mean you have to go about it in the same way. But what I think is useful about this model is it's not a one-size-fits-all model. It can be tuned to what your desires and your goals are. And with anything, one of the overarching ideas behind this podcast is that solo people often have more degrees of freedom. That is, they can afford to make the pivot. They can afford to make the change. They can pursue what is truly going to help them flourish. It's going to help you flourish because you're willing to step away from what the norm is. The norm being, people will say, okay, well, you've got your college degree. Well, now you should get a job. Okay, you got a job. What should you do next? Okay, you should buy a house. Okay, what should you do next? Okay, you should get married. Okay, what should you do next? Okay, you should have kids. And so that path, which while may be good for some people and may bring them a great deal of pleasure, and I should say rather can help them live their remarkable life, I think that is probably overprescribed, that there are people like you who might benefit from an alternative path. And so I think that first getting health in order, as I talk about in Solo Thoughts 1, is really foundational to anything that you're going to be doing. Here in Solo Thoughts 2 for well-being, I think it's really important to start to develop a little bit of a plan, a little bit of a perspective about what is it that compels you, right? What is it compels you that doesn't have this sort of sugary profile, right? The idea is you want a more of a salad profile, so to speak. That is, salads are good to eat. They take a little bit more effort to eat. Don't ever try to eat a salad when you're in a rush, right? That's why Snickers advertises the way they do. But a salad profile has benefits in the moment, but then also has these long-term benefits. I just came up with that salad thing. Forgive me if it doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you for listening. I may try a few more of these and doing some more specific things. At some point, I'll talk about some a little bit more solo topics. But I think that's it for now. Again, thanks for listening. Tell me what you think. And until next time, cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.com. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.